Mini episode 886 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge, mini episode number 886. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris, and it is my distinct honor and pleasure to bring together a very esteemed panel today. A very sad subject. It is the passing of the late, great Bobby the Brain Heenan, and we are going to do justice, though, to his life with a couple of gentlemen who really, as I said to them off air, really kind of kick-started this whole thing of wrestling talk back in the day on the, essentially what I've always said is the Yankee Stadium of sports talk radio, WFAN in New York, the first one to go full-time sports talk 30 years ago. These guys were doing it. They had a show that was on every week, Keep It in the Ring, and it's a great honor and pleasure to have both of them on. A couple guys who have been good friends of the show over a period of time. I have enjoyed having them on previously and spoken with them. Rich Mancuso from Keep It in the Ring, NY Sports Day, among other great outlets out there, and Rich was very instrumental in something that meant a lot to this show, the booking that we were able to get from his friend Burt Randolph Sugar, and that was a show that we always will treasure, being able to have had him on, and his part in hooking that up was greatly appreciated. Rich, always very much involved in covering combat sports. Rich, thank you so much for being on today.
It's a pleasure. This is great. It's always good to reunite with my old wrestling partner, Jody McDonald. How are you, Jody? Good, Richard. Always my pleasure, my friend.
And Jody, such a pleasure to have you on, sir. A great sports talker, whether it be WIP, WFAN, CBS Sports Radio, Sirius XM, the list goes on and on and on. And as I have caught over a period of time, from time to time, I've seen you substituting for Dan Patrick on his show. Jody, it's always a pleasure to have you on, whatever the subject matter. Thank you so much for being on today as well.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to it.
Well, again, this is it's a bittersweet occasion out there as we talk about this, because, again, I know there's going to be some smiles on the faces, as I know at least the corporate WWE likes to put it, but for once it's actually apropos, because you can't look back on the career of Bobby the Brain Heenan without having a lot of smiles, a lot of laughs. It's often been said that he was the wittiest guy, the funniest guy, basically, in any locker room, wherever he was. And before we get into the specifics, and I'll kind of go back and forth on the order here, but I'll start with you, Jody. Anything off the top of your head that it occurs to you to say about the late, great Bobby the Brain Heenan?
He was an integral part of taking wrestling to a new level. And Rich and I, and you have been fans long enough to go back to when it was the WWF, let alone the WWE and the many transformations it's made, but it has been an incremental growth over the period of 40, 50 years. And I think that Bobby Heenan, as a non-wrestler, and I know he wrestled some, but in the WWE he was just a manager/broadcaster. As a non-wrestler, anyone whose last name is not McMahon, I would say he had as big an influence as anyone else at raising, we now call it branding. Back when Bobby was doing it, we didn't know what branding was. But he helped to raise the brand of wrestling, and specifically the WWE, because he was so good at what he did as both a manager and as a color commentator.
Very profound, Jody. I certainly agree with that. I think you're very right. I think you raised some very excellent points as far as how we remember him and what his impact and his importance was to the company and to the industry as a whole. Rich, what would you add to that?
Well, I think Jody nailed it right on the head. You know, he was a part of that WWF time, the explosion, and the epitome of a manager at ringside. He got involved in the action and later evolved into a great broadcaster, and that chemistry with Gorilla Monsoon. We know the history with that. Now, I always said that Bobby the Brain Heenan taught a lot of the guys that are doing this now, and they're not him. They're not him. I mean, what he did was special. He got involved in the action like no one else. Plus, he had the mouth to do it. He could. They tell him to say one thing, he could go on and on and on, and it made the storyline. And that's what wrestling is all about, the storyline. And specifically WrestleMania number 3, and you're never going to forget 93,000 in Pontiac Silverdome. And then Bobby the Brain Heenan going down a long entranceway in that little cart, and it's Hulk Hogan, and it's Andre the Giant, and Bobby the Brain Heenan is with Andre the Giant, and that made Bobby the Brain Heenan WrestleMania number 3. There's no doubt about it. He was the character before, but WrestleMania number 3 made him, and to this day I will say that, and I'll say this, I'll go another step further. If you look at all the great wrestling managers of all time, and I've watched the game, watched wrestling since I was 5 years old, maybe even younger, and I remember Ernie Roth, the Grand Wizard, and the Sheik, the original Sheik, had a manager like that. No one could do what Bobby the Brain did. He came in at a time when wrestling was evolving, the ratings skyrocketed through him, and he was a part of that explosion. In history, my top wrestling manager of all time, and that says a lot.
Well, you did a lot to anticipate some of the things we're going to talk about there, Rich. Very great points. And actually, and I'm going to start with you on this time around here. Again, I'm going to put it out there for why I agree with you on him being the greatest manager of all time. I think there's 3 criteria that I look at, and in my estimation, first of all, I look at what he was able to do in terms of footprints in the sand, pop culture. Who do we think of when we think pro wrestling manager? Before he really exploded on the scene with the national expansion of the WWF in the 80s, you would say probably Captain Lou Albano, more famous than him, Freddie Blassie, but they kind of faded out of the picture in the beginning of the boom period when he was just hitting his stride. So I think he surmounted them as far as pop culture and who we think of with pro wrestling managers. Certainly his association with the All Madden team had something to do with that. So that's my first criteria. My second one would be who managed a bigger roster of stars over a period of time. You mentioned Andre the Giant, Ric Flair really at the tail end of the managerial part of his career, and everybody in between. He managed a lot of the biggest names. The Bobby Heenan family was always positioned as the lead stable of the 1980s and as Hulk Hogan's biggest nemesis at that time. Number 3, this is where we get a little bit nerdy, I guess, on my part in looking at the wrestling business, but they always say drawing money is what is most important. That's the bottom line. And I don't ever hear anybody talking about this. In 1975 in the AWA, you had a promotion that had been built on a babyface world champion, Vern Gagne, for the better part of 15 years. For the better part of the next 5 years, Nick Bockwinkel was on top with Bobby Heenan as his manager. And I know in the pre-pay-per-view age, time moved slower. It's not exactly the same thing as 5 years today, no question about that. But to manage, there's never been anybody on top as a heel champion in, let's say, a mega territory, because I think that's what the old WWF and the AWA were essentially mega territories back in the day. And I would say that Bockwinkel being on top that long is almost as impressive as Bruno being on top for 8 years, because Bruno was a baby face. I think it's a little bit easier when you're sending the fans home happy every night than when you're putting off the payoff for 5 years as the AWA did. So on those 3 criteria, Rich, I rank him as the best. What are the things specifically that you think are most important in rating him as the best?
The way he spoke, the way he performed. Like I said earlier, when you told him to say something, he stayed with the script, but he went beyond. And he went beyond expectations. And I don't think they expected that. For Bobby the Brain Heenan to go on as good as he did. He wasn't really known to be like that. But he fell into it. He fell into what we call a trap. And it was his right trap. And he was able to do it so well. Now, you mentioned Bruno Sammartino, who I grew up with. But remember, Bruno was always by himself till the Golden Boy Arnold Swollen came into the picture.
Right.
Remember that?
Yep.
And Arnold Skolin was not Bobby Heenan. So you paired Bobby Heenan with the right guy, and Bobby Heenan also made that superstar a superstar.
Absolutely. He always added a lot of extra rub to everybody that he was associated with. And Jody, I'm curious to know from your point of view. So Rich and I have gone on record. We think he's the greatest of all time and laid out the reasons why. Do you rank him as the absolute number one, or just in there with a couple of other guys? And what are the most important criteria in your mind in making that assessment?
Well, not to say so because we had tragically lost him, but I'm going to make it 3 for 3 and say I think he's the most successful manager of all time in wrestling. Surprisingly, the guy, and you guys may or may not agree with me on this, I would say Paul Heyman is the second best of all time. Yes, I was a huge Mr. Fuji fan, and Jimmy Hart, and the guys that you've thrown out there already are all-time great managers. But Heyman is on an island by himself because he's the only one who's doing it anymore. And for him to be able to continue to do it at the level that he does is, I think, says tons about Heyman. That'll tell you how great Heenan is. Because Heenan would be managing 5, 6, 7 different individuals at once during his heyday as a manager. Heenan only has to concentrate on one individual, and that's Brock Lesnar. And I'm not saying it should be diminishing job that he does, because I think he's phenomenal at what he does, but it's just easier. And Heenan had to keep up with all the character traits and how to work and play off all the different guys in his stable and the Heenan family. So if you're like me, who thinks Heyman is number 2, to put Heenan at number 1, put him so far ahead of Heyman because he handled so many different individuals, tells you if it was the race, he'd win by 20 lengths. Bobby Heenan is the greatest manager of all time.
Jody, just to follow up on that real quick, because you put a thought in my head that I don't think was necessarily there before. You're right about that. You look at the incarnations of him, from the cell phone back in the late 80s to the psycho yuppie in early ECW to everything, the different incarnations that he's had in WWE. He's almost Scotty Bowman, isn't he, as far as a manager here? I mean, I know this is a Heenan show and not a Heyman show, but you make such a great point about Heyman. You know, he's navigated several different eras almost in the way that Scotty Bowman did in actual sports.
I had not tied those two in, but yes, the ability to change face and go from one to the other and handle different type wrestling. Yeah, he was a bad guy. He was a heel manager, and he didn't manage baby faces, but the heels themselves were just so different, the types of personalities and the type of wrestlers they were, and it didn't matter. That Heenan just seemed to fit like a glove with all of them, and I think that added to his lore as the greatest manager of all time. And he became an entertainer, guys, as we know.
Yep.
Heenan came into the time when WWF was going into that sports entertainment mode, and he fit the bill perfectly, and that's what he did. Whereas now you got Heyman, who's the sole representative of Brock Lesnar, who has the mouth, who has the style, gets involved in the action, but he's not the entertainer that Bobby Heenan was, that took it to that step that he could go on the microphone. And also, you know, we got to bring this up, how he made the transition and he just changed and went to WCW, their chief rival, and now we helped them and propelled them to the top at one point, and then goes back to the WWF. So that's another remarkable thing about him business-wise.
Absolutely, and I want to take it broader, as you guys were both kind of indicating there, as far as, again, when I talk about his footprints in the sand and how we remember him and the lasting memories of Bobby Heenan, because the managing was just, I won't say the tip of the iceberg, because it's the foundation on which everything else was built. But whether it be the byplay with, again, his byplay with Gorilla Monsoon, I would rate as the greatest of all time, and him and Mean Gene might be number 2. I would put maybe either of those ahead of JR and the King, as high as JR and the King are.
Yeah.
You know, so...
You just saw the expressions. I was just looking at some old video a couple of nights ago again, and you see the expressions on both their faces, Monsoon and Heenan. It's hilarious. And Jody and I used to talk about that in the studio at 3 o'clock in the morning, about how well that was done. We used to look at that and laugh at it. Because you that became pro wrestling entertainment at the time, and you still knew the heel from the baby face as well.
Yep.
Today you don't know who the heel is or the baby face is many times. Like Roman Reigns, we never know what side he's on.
That's a great point. And, as far as him being an entertainer, and I'll start with you on this point, Jody, it's a thing where I look at it, and him being the great broadcaster that he was, I mean, broadcast journalist used to be his punchline back in the day, but essentially, color commentator, I think, in wrestling, that's a job that doesn't really date back past the national expansion of 1984, because in the territory days, you didn't really need to have a color commentator. You just have the studio guy talking about stuff. But when you start expanding into it, I mean, it's a short list. If you want to put anybody on Bobby Heenan's level, some would say Jesse Ventura. I had somebody say to me the other day, Larry Zbyszko, but I would think that would be a minority opinion. The greatest one of today, Corey Graves, he simply tweeted out the night of Bobby Heenan's passing, "Without him, there is no me." And I think that's very profound, and I think that's very true. And the great compliment that a lot of people, say about Corey Graves is that he reminds them in a lot of ways of a modern version of Bobby Heenan, and that's much to his credit if that's true. But his greatness as a color commentator with the entertainment that he brought, this is one of these things, Jody, where I flash back to when Macho Man Randy Savage passed away. We did a retrospective with the great Alex Marvez on the show talking about this, and I remember saying at the time that as an all-around pro wrestling personality, a figure, whatever, I couldn't think of hardly anybody else that would have been received in the same way that Randy Savage was, where we looked back and we remembered great matches and promos and everything like that. And I think we saw with the near-death experience of Ric Flair that he's regarded in the same way. But Bobby Heenan, I think it's the three of them that kind of stand alone as far as how they're remembered, as far as, with some wrestlers like Hulk Hogan, you can poke holes in the work rate. Roddy Piper, wasn't so great of a broadcaster when he got called upon to do that. No offense to him. Dusty Rhodes, the same can be true as well. He wasn't as great of a broadcaster as he was speaking for himself. But Bobby Heenan seems like one of these guys like Flair, like Savage, that you look at every aspect of his performance, Jody, and I would think it's kind of hard to poke any holes.
Here's the reason why I think he was, we've all agreed that he's the greatest manager of all time. And he may very well be the greatest color commentator of all time as well. And for me, it's a very simple reason. He brought the entertainment, he brought the information, he brought the personality, but you never felt that it was about him. He kept it about the wrestling. He kept it about the individuals in the ring. He kept it about Vince McMahon and the overall federation. And if he ever brought it to the announce table, it was more to make fun of his partner, usually Gorilla Monsoon, than anybody else. But it was never about Bobby the Brain Heenan. Even when guys who were still wrestling, who he had been manager of, and he turned into a broadcast, he wasn't managing anymore. There were a couple of guys that were still wrestling, not at the top of their game anymore, but making returns and the like. And it was never about Bobby the Brain. It was about everything but Bobby the Brain. And he kept the focus on everybody else. And he was a big enough star into his own right that he probably could have made it about Bobby the Brain. And we've had a lot of announcers, Ventura being the first one that comes to mind, who would oftentimes make it about himself, which Jesse was great in his day, but he wasn't even that great all that long. And I think if you listen to Jesse do his stuff, you would think that he was the greatest wrestler of all time. You never got that with Heenan, and that's the reason why I appreciated Heenan as much as the color commentators I did.
Absolutely, and right around the time that you guys were doing your show on FAN, when Heenan left the WWF and went over and helped eventually build Nitro into what it was, but when he left, it really did kind of fall off a cliff, because I remember listening in the last year or two to some pay-per-views around then, and Ted DiBiase on color commentary. You talk again. I don't want to harsh on anybody else during a Bobby Heenan tribute, but you talk about somebody that really was not capable of putting over other people. It would always, every other word would be about his $1 Million Man gimmick, or Kurt Hennig when he was doing it. Oh, he's a great wrestler, but he's not perfect. I mean, there really is an art to drawing the attention to the guys who are in the ring and not yourself. And I've been critical.
And he made, if you remember on WCW, he was paired with Steve McMichael,
yes,
a football player.
Yes.
He made him.
Yes.
He made him. McMichael knew nothing about wrestling. and couldn't call a move from anything. Didn't know anything about the game. Heenan made McMichael look good on the air, and that's another thing that we have to bring up because he really did. And they started to become a very popular team with Eric Bischoff. It was fantastic stuff.
That is a great point. And turning to you, Rich, what are some things that you look at in terms of things he brought to the industry, areas in which he shined? I know we've talked about, just generally speaking, being on the mic, being entertaining, being able to cut promos. But when you think of Bobby Heenan, Rich, what are some of the things you think of where you think, gee, some guys today could really learn how to do that a little better?
Well, you can learn a lot about the industry. I mean, a lot of these young guys, and I'm not around it no more. I'm really not around the game no more. I've become a fan just like everyone else.
Okay.
But some of the old-timers that I talk to, and this guy brought respect to the table, not only with Vince McMahon and the company, but with the guys in the locker room. And in a wrestling locker room, there's always one guy, like John Cena, needs a lot of respect to them, okay? So one guy back then, there were a few of them, but one guy that always stood out was not Hulk Hogan. It was Bobby the Brain Heenan. They loved him. They gravitated to him. As he gravitated to them. And he was able to offer his knowledge, and most of all, and I can remember this very vividly, I remember once the Iron Sheik talking to him backstage, and the Iron Sheik was the funniest character in the world. And these two in a conversation together, you didn't know what the heck they were talking about. But one thing I can tell you is the Iron Sheik sat there and listened to everything he said. And Kaz was never one of those guys, that being the Iron Sheik, that can communicate well with anyone. But boy, could he communicate with Bobby Heenan. It was fantastic stuff. Everything from how to get better on the mic, and he would get the mic in his hand and try and beat Bobby Heenan at times. And it worked. It really worked. It was just that you got to remember more about Bobby Heenan. It's respect, that word respect, which doesn't happen as much in the wrestling room anymore. And again, I'm not around it, but I hear things. And again, it's sad. We knew he lived his later years of his life in pain. And if he had still been healthy, I'm sure he would have been around more. And it would have been a pleasure to have him.
That's absolutely right. It's a shame that his later years were filled with so much pain, and you are correct to focus the attention on that being the bigger tragedy. But yes, the business could have benefited from him more over the course of the last 14 or 15 years. It was a loss for the business as well. And again, in terms of, you sort of give me that thought there in terms of what you were saying. I think everybody in the pro wrestling business could probably use a little bracelet with, the initials on it for what would Bobby Heenan do, because, if you're in that business and you think about how Heenan went about stuff, you could certainly do worse than that. So as we go full circle on this thing here, circling around to any kind of thoughts we haven't gotten to yet, I'll start with you, Rich. Anything else on Bobby Heenan in terms of what he meant to the business, to your fandom, or anything else that we haven't really covered yet?
Well, he's a guy that I never really got to know, and I'm sorry I didn't. I worked with him a little bit, very little, got to know him, but not as well as I would have liked to. And I'm saddened about that because he brought so much to the industry, and he epitomized what a pro wrestling manager could be. And he was just that. He was made to be in the industry. He was gifted, and most of all, he brought respect, like I just said. It was sad to see him the way he was the last few years, and to see him before his death the way he was. That wasn't Bobby the Brain. That wasn't him. That's not the guy we remember. But we could always remember those memories that he brought to the WWF and WCW over the years.
Very well said. And again, it's all a matter of perspective, because I know what you're talking about here. There's always a time with anybody like Bobby Heenan, of where the people who knew him wish they'd been able to spend more time with him and know him a little bit better. But I can say from my perspective, I'm envious of the extent to which you were able to get to know him, because that's the kind of thing right there that a lot of people who were fans of his, the great vast majority, would have at least like to have been able to have had the opportunity to shake his hands and say thanks for all the memories and for all the fun times you brought into my life. And certainly that's my perspective of it, and that's what I intended this show to be, was a proper and fitting tribute.
And I'm going to tell Jody, do you hear me, Jody? Yeah. I mean, we tried to get Bobby on the show, but we couldn't succeed because of the WWF, and they felt we were infringing on their turf a little bit. But we did get Jim Cornette on, I think, once, and Jim Cornette had a lot of Bobby the Brain Heenan in him.
Yes.
The Jim could go on and on, but he was no Bobby the Brain Heenan.
We had Corny on the show twice, and he is quite a handful and a great manager in his own regard. Also, too, I mean, I'm just going to mention this because we've talked about a lot of other great managers here, and I don't want to slight this guy. One of the favorite managers from my childhood who we've also had on the program, I'm a big fan of J.J. Dillon, and when we were voting on the show one time for the best pro wrestling manager of all time for our Pantheon, I thought about going J.J. Dillon, but then I remembered that J.J. said that he thought that Bobby was the greatest of all time, so I thought, well, who am I to go against J.J. Dillon on that one? But, Jody...
How could you not?
How could you not? Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Jody, from your perspective, anything that we didn't really kind of hit yet as far as your thoughts on Bobby Heenan and what he meant to you and what he meant to the business?
Yeah. First, in reference to what Rich said, yes, Richie tried really hard for the time that we did the show together to try and get current day wrestling personalities, be they wrestlers and or people from the front office of the WWE, managers and the like. And yes, he reached out and tried his hardest to get people from the WWE. And I think it's both ironic and unfortunate that at the time the WWF, as it was known then, thought that guys doing stuff away from their control and their federation and getting direct impact was a bad idea. Now, you see wrestlers on SportsCenter, on ESPN, and they do anything to promote their pay-per-views and the like, and someone finally got in Vince's ear and told him, publicity is publicity, and it doesn't all have to be controlled by you if you need to lend out some of your people, and as long as they're well-trained and they know what they can say and what they should say and what they shouldn't say, it's only going to help your business, your product. And now you can see WWE guys everywhere, through many different venues. And it's unfortunate that Richie wasn't able to land those guys back then, but didn't come from a lack of effort from Rich. We were always trying to get the guys, and instead the guys we would get would be former wrestlers, former employees of Vince, and or from other federations and the like. And that is tremendously unfortunate that we just, wrong place, wrong time for us in what we were doing way back then. And yes, I too would have loved to have had Bobby Heenan on one of our shows. And here's the thing I'll say about Heenan, the thing that I think he's got to feel best about if he's watching down from the big wrestling ring in the sky. He was, for me, other than Heenan, the last great manager. That there were a couple others that lingered afterwards, but none of them anywhere near the level of what Heenan was. And I think that, again, while I rip Vince off of Vince's credit, he realized we need to get our wrestlers to be the entertainers on the microphone more than our managers as the entertainers on the microphone, because it's only going to put forth our product better and sell more merchandise, that they're not only great wrestlers, but great talkers and performers as well. So Vince eventually got that right, too, by making his wrestlers into great performers as well. But I think part of it was anyone who came after Heenan kind of paled in comparison. And the only guy who's really been able to hold up that mantle is Heenan himself, and they don't even overuse Heenan. Heyman just use him as Brock Lesnar's guy. I think that is a fitting tribute to Bobby Heenan. He was the last who agreed. He took it to a new level, and at the time, probably because of a couple of different factors, the industry realized that we need to move away from the managers. We can't emphasize the managers as much as we can. We can't have them be as big a star as the show as they've been previously, because it's just not going to be, we're not going to be able to do it, because nobody's as good as this as Bobby the Brain was.
No question about that. And again, maybe that's the most fitting tribute of all when you look at his career, is to say, because of the way that the business has evolved, and it's unlikely to ever evolve back to what it was, that there truly never will be anyone like him. You really can't say that about any kind of wrestler, because great wrestlers continue to come along, and they really, a lot of them, that's the way the business goes. They kind of borrow from the past. Dean Ambrose clearly has a lot of, Terry Funk in him, a little bit of Dick Slater, maybe Brian Pillman, whatever. Wrestlers are sort of like a hodgepodge of what's come before and what they borrow from. But Bobby Heenan, yeah, there truly never will be anyone like him, because the business doesn't allow for it. But I don't think anybody else is ever going to be born with the skill set that Bobby Heenan had. And again, that's what's most important. That's what set him apart by all accounts. A great family man, very kind individual to the people around him, funny as hell, clearly, and a great loss to the business and to everyone who knew him. I can't thank you guys enough for doing this show here today. A pleasure to be the third man in the ring with the two of you. Hopefully I was closer to being Dick Kroll than Danny Davis.
I gotta ask Jody this one
Go ahead.
question. Jody, reunion time. The fans want it, and we need to at least meet once and have some of the old fans that we have on Facebook, Twitter, and everywhere else, and get together, New York or Philly, wherever you want to do it, and we have one night, again, with JM and RM, keep it in the ring, and we could relive some of the great moments. And, I look back on those shows, Jody, and I hear some of the audio. Some of these fans stayed and archived our shows on YouTube, and I can't believe what we did in the 2 or 3 years we did that. I think we were on together for 4 years or 3. 3 and change, yeah. 3, it's unbelievable what we did for 1 hour and maybe more than an hour. It is unbelievable. Every time I go back and I just think back and how great it was, and I hope we can have that one reunion with the fans somewhere. We got to work on it, my friend.
It was fun. I would love to do it again. It was different. It was ahead of its time. I didn't really think the wrestling business was going to move as much as it did, but it has. And anytime you want to do a podcast or something like that, mentioned earlier, there are podcasts everywhere on the wrestling industry. Anytime you want to do one with me, Richard, it would be my pleasure.
And a reunion, we got to do that. Guys, it's been great. Keep it in the ring.
Thank you so much. And again, what you guys did really was revolutionary at that time. I go back a little over a decade. I was sort of the fifth Beatle on a wrestling talk show back then called Sunday Night Submission, and I think of that as, something that came along before a lot of the ones today, but you guys were well before even what we did. So again, all credit to you guys, and so happy to be able to experience some of the magic between you guys talking wrestling tonight. Want to thank you both. Jody, thank you very much for your time, sir.
My pleasure, anytime.
Really appreciate it. And Rich, thank you so much for being a part of this today. Really appreciate your thoughts, your insights.
Anytime. Keep it in the ring.
Keep it in the ring, fellas. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in for our Bobby the Brain Heenan tribute on the FDH Lounge. And a fitting last word for everybody is, I suppose, to say, for all the humanoids and white sockers out there, Bobby the Brain Heenan is looking down from the sky at you. Good night, everybody.
As we bring the show to a close, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all Clear Channel affiliates, TNT, TBS, USA, UPN, Deadspin.com, YouTube.com, YTMND.com, MySpace.com, various blogs, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, IamBoard.com, Billboard.com, Google.com, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic, NBA TV, NFL Network, Sports Time Ohio, Athlon Magazine, Comedy Central, Cartoon Network, The Boomerang Channel, QVC, BET, The Spice Channel, Steno Notebooks, Manwich, Papermate Office Supplies, waitresses, strippers, bartenders, garbage men, janitors, microwave popcorn, the writers of The Office, Scrubs, Entourage, My Name is Earl, Oz, Metalocalypse and the Boondocks, Aquafina, and the Periodic Table of Elements.